everyone. I think we're going to get going. I see there are quite a number of people online and there are a few people in the venue. I'm going to do a quick introduction and then I'll hand over to Alice, who's in person, and Mark, who you can see online, who are joining us today from Square One for today's school talk. Just a quick bio for each of them. Mark is the director of Square One Landscape Architects and has over 25 years of experience working with landscapes across Africa and Australia. He is passionate about designing with natural systems and placemaking strategies to support more livable and experientially rich communities. Together with the Square One team, Mark applies the ethos of people, place, and planet to all sectors and scales of the built environment in both urban and rural contexts. Their work has been recognized with awards from the International Federation of Landscape Architecture, as well as the South African Institute for Landscape Architects in South Africa and the Australian Institute for Landscape Architecture. Mark also drives environmentally and culturally responsive innovation through speaking, teaching, and jury service. He has contributed to teaching and examining at UNSW and UTS in Sydney and UCT and UP in South Africa. And he has served as a juror for IFLA and the Australian Institute for Landscape Architects. And Alice, who is with us in person, is a young designer at Square One, and she's committed to assisting in resolving nature-based design solutions. She completed her Master in Landscape Architecture last year at the University of Pretoria and received a LASA President's Award for Design. In practice, she continually advocates for social and ecological impact. Thank you both so much for joining us. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hi, thanks, Christine. I need to add that I did also study at UCT. I finished a master's in 2007 after having spent some time of initial studies in horticulture in Australia and the UK. And Square One are now 13 years old, and we work across Africa and Australia. And as Christine mentioned, we really subscribe to this ethos of people, place, and planet. And for people, we're really trying to find ways that we can design environments, use natural systems to create places for people that are healthier, more connected, and more resilient. And we do that through designing spaces, applying our skills in spatial design, and understanding contexts in all sectors, whether it's educational facilities or commercial premises or residential areas, and trying to find what nature has to offer each of those sites, and then bringing out those experiential opportunities through scent and color and placemaking. And for planet, it's really looking at how can we do things better. We know that the built environment has a massive impact on our world, and we're constantly looking for ways that we can improve how we do things, bring nature back. And this talk is really looking at how we've tried to do that as best we could over the past few years. So some old projects, but also some of the new ones that we're currently working on.
So why are we here today? It's basically to show you that there's different layers of complexity that goes into landscape designs, and doing a very complex landscape in different contexts. So otherwise you just end up like what you can see here as different cliches scattered across the landscape. And we use this performance systems to actually analyze our landscapes and the performance of the landscapes many times based on the ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are basically benefits people derive from landscapes. And you'll see now that it can be quite catastrophic if you do not look after these ecosystem services. So starting with supporting services are basically, it forms the basis for all ecosystems, and these include soil formation, biodiversity, photosynthesis, and food production. Then, so you can see here that if you do not look after it, and a well-known example is the drought a few years ago, because of the 5.9 billion rand loss in the agricultural sector with the previous drought, 30,000 people lost their jobs. So the consequences are quite severe. And it's good to keep in mind that we are firm-based in Australia as well as in South Africa, and many of our climatic conditions do have overlap. So a lot of problems they have, we have also. So provisioning services are basically the byproducts that we gain from looking after our ecosystems, and this is clean water, pollination, cool temperatures, and flooding control. So if we do not look after these ecosystems, and once again, you can see an example of here in the Western Cape, where in 2024, 15,000 structures have been damaged, and obviously a lot of people have suffered quite severely from this. And then regulating services are basically the climatic and environmental conditions that are regulated by ecosystems. And this include clean air, clean air, purified water, and nutrient cycles. Thanks, Mark. And if you do not regulate your ecosystems, like for example in the Western Cape, if you do not mitigate your alien species as well as keep your environments in check, then in the Winelands district, over 6,000 hectares of vegetation have burnt down, along with 40 structures in 2024 alone. And we need burning in our fynbos regions, but it's burning too frequently. And cultural services are basically the intangible benefits we gain from ecosystems. And this includes habitat creation, stewardship, aesthetics, and recreational areas. And why we need this is, obviously, we need to keep this in mind when we are constructing and building more into the future, as the current rate of urban sprawl, like here in the Western Cape, we're going to need 10 cities of Cape Town by 2050 if we're keeping to this rate of urban sprawl. So I'm handing over to Mark, as he is now going to show you how it should be done.
Thanks. Well, buckle in because we've got a lot of slides to get through, so we can all go through them. I really had to keep myself from having a last coffee. It's 9:10 in the evening yet, so I need to keep up the pace, otherwise I'll be off. The first project that we're looking at, where we really got to apply a lot of principles, was Plessis. It's a wine farm in the Breda Valley, and it's known obviously for this chapel by C.S. Steyn. And our client approached us to find ways that we could increase the capacity of the farm. The popularity of this and other venues had meant that they weren't able to have as many weddings as they would have liked. They weren't able to invite as many guests. And so they asked us to look at opportunities for expansion. There were various considerations and constraints that we had to figure out. One of them was heritage considerations, and one of the mandates from Heritage Western Cape was that in order for us to acknowledge and respect the manor house, we were to consider how this tract of land that we were looking at was designed as a microcosm of the valley section, so that Breda River Valley section, with the manor house as the one ridgeline behind, as the manors and gables often represent, and the chapel on the other side are representing the mountains on the other side. But this was what we were given. This was the tract of land, heavily denuded. The soil was wrecked, over-fertilizing, and years of overuse had meant that it was no longer viable. All the topsoil had been removed and was full of weeds. And this is areas known as Vaihoek, which means windy corner. So it really gets nailed by all the elements seasons it gets drought in certain seasons and flooding the next. And this is what we were able to turn it into. And it wasn't easy. It was a long process working with ecologists or working with Vula to find ways to prepare the soil, which Alice will talk to you a bit more, but then also finding ways to bring meaning back to the site. And that mandate to represent that cultural landscape informed our design approach, which was working ecology into the cultural landscape. And so you'll see even in this photo that we start to represent some of the elements that we see throughout the winery. And we also think about how we use our local context. So in this case, the farm had a whole lot of river boulders that had been pushed aside from the fields that could be cultivated. And we thought this would be a fantastic opportunity to create all the structures within the landscape. So we had to go out and find people that knew a little bit about stone masonry and get them trained up so that they could help, and that we could also help them to improve their skill set in the valley. And we did the same through Vula. We worked with local landscape teams to develop the skills in rehabilitation. But also what you'll notice here is the water coming through, and some of those elements that are visible in the valley include reservoirs, stormwater, grachte or slote. And this was our plan, just to walk you through the structuring elements. Because it's such a narrow site, Julia from our office came up with this device to bring this grand arch curve into the landscape. So that did a couple of things for us. It elongated the journey and allowed people to move through a various sequence of elevation. But it also did a clever little trick, which was to allow people to move through the site and not realize that there were buildings in the landscape. So that was one of the criteria imposed by Heritage Cape, that no outbound buildings or no buildings were to be visible from the manor house. So our response was to sink them into the ground, and you can see them here and here. This one here is the shop with horses, offices, administrative offices over here. And this one is the deli with an industrial kitchen that services the whole restaurant complex and various other functions and picnics and that sort of thing. So the design is divided into three sections. The top one was a forest rehabilitation area, referencing the forests in the valleys and the mountains in the area. The second one was a more open woodland, which houses the primary activities. It has openings in those tree canopies for events, marquees, weddings, and other gatherings. And then the bottom area was the Renosterveld and Fynbos rehabilitation area. And as you probably know, or I hope you know, that Renosterveld is less than 2% conserved in the world. And so it's a very, very scarce ecosystem that is very much under pressure because it occurs on land that is of high nutrient value and very favorable for farming. So some of the other structuring elements is this line that takes you through to the chapel, and also referencing the windbreaks in the area. Those were necessary because we wanted to create nursery-like conditions for a lot of planting to happen over time. And this is what it turned out to be. This is an early photo that still has purified itself, but you can see some of the check dams and the scales that come through here, and those playgrounds that reference those reservoir systems. This is one of the buildings. That's the shop and offices. This is now gone. But the whole idea was that you walk through the site, walk over the roof of the building, not even notice until you came around to the front of the building. The sinking into the landscape allowed us to create sheltered environments. People could be outside, out of the wind. And we just thought a lot about how we can use indigenous and some exotic planting to enrich people's experience of nature. So it's a bit of a hyper nature thing going on here. And a large factor was that we had limited water supply, and we had water that was not ideal for irrigation for the farm or for the grounds. So we worked really hard, the engineers, to design a system that could filter the water, that could also provide habitat, as in this deck for fish to grow. We designed a system of check dams to drop out the iron, and a system of weirs to filter out the salts in the water that all went down to that dam. But all the time, as you can see, we're thinking about how do we activate these functions in the landscape to create amenity for people. And you can see even just by bringing water through in these little stone channels, just enriches that experience for visitors. We designed a splash pad. We work with local materials, gum poles, and we brought in some vertical rope because we didn't want to import materials from Coracord in Spain. And so a lot of this stuff we had to design from scratch, and just trying to think through how kids engage and climb and get active in the landscape. This is the top area I mentioned, the forest. And so we have a wild play area over there with a giant slide. And we created this viewing platform, this canopy walk. And it's designed to view both the valley beyond, but also the progress of this forest as it grows up over time. So we used a number of companion planting techniques to make sure that these plants, these trees grow up quicker, and support each other, and over time it will be fully embedded in that canopy. But we've also included fun little things for kids to climb down and climb through and swing. And this is just looking down on the swales towards the chapel, and you can see the start of these windbreaks planted very densely. The poplar trees are quite useful in that way, and then creating shelter for these natural swales. And this just shows some of the qualities of the space and how seasonal planting can be used to evoke a sense of wonder and joy in the landscape, just by thinking through how we design with plants and bring them to the fore. And there you can see Nelia dancing through the rhinosterfelter. And what's remarkable about this site is that we hear time and time again that people's most valued part of the experience is this rhinosterfelter area, just seeing nature working. This client was very keen to give back to the valley that he grew up in, and for generations his family have lived in. So he gifted a school that we also got to work on with Mayor and Associates Architect. We were brought on a bit later. We'd been appointed at Borsius, and they asked if we could also help out with the landscape. So luckily the architects had pushed the building down into the ground again to create a sheltered area out there. But again, even though there was a limited budget for us, we wanted to reference those rural qualities. It is a farm school. These kids' parents work in farms, and we wanted to create an environment that acknowledged and celebrated, provided an enriching experience for them, connecting back to their natural heritage, and providing food for their food program. They grow their own veggies and fruits. We've got a fruit orchard out the back for their lunches. And through it again, we work with the stormwater system. It's all reticulated through the site, picks up water from the buildings, grey water, black water. It's all taken through a package plant and a reed bed. And even at the front, walk water that can be used as a market absorbs stormwater and demonstrates that as well. Never pushing water into the ground, into channels where it just disappears, but we're showing what happens when it and keeping people connected. I think that's so key in schools where budgets are so tight. Kids really need to understand the environment, and it's a useful platform for them to learn about science and their world, and help teach them to be good stewards of the world. So this is how the system works. We have wind turbine that generate electricity, and solar energy on the roofs, as well as roof gardens that help to lower the heat gain of the buildings. And there's some of the playgrounds. We designed with the budget. We worked with gum poles and put them together, designed them ourselves, and we've engaged with principals who help us understand that kids often in rural schools are quite hectic, and some of the bully kids will dominate the swings if we have normal swing seats. So they remove the seats, just not there as much. Them embrace their core strength, and also tire out a lot quicker. So there are a lot of fun things that we learned through this engagement, and just adding terrain for kids to clamber up and down, and bringing in beautiful roof gardens for them to explore. Also connecting the building back to its environment with these skylights that go down into the library, connect kids back to the sky. There you can see how they are all over the place. Over to Alice.
So just back to our performance criteria, we're going to see how these supporting services are now shown in different elements in these two above mentioned case studies. So these are photos taken from bushes, and these are the local biodiversity attracted to by the native species that we've implemented on site, and the water bodies that attract these birds. So if you create habitats for them, they're going to be there. And as for Buertas Halter, the food gardens, as Mark mentioned, is part of the food program at the school, and it not only functions as an educational tool, but also is a valuable resource to the community. As for provisioning services, go on. What? So here you see how the landscape in the example at Buertas Halter has used services as not only amenity but also as a functional system. So at the amphitheatre, you create this immersive experience within this native vegetated berm, but it also protects the sport field from wind, so it acts as a windbreak. And here, where all the stormwater is collected at Buertas Halter and this attenuation pond, it acts as this beautiful feature within the landscape, but it's also reticulated back into the landscape by the wind tower you see at the back there. I can go on. And then for back to bushes is the same principle, where we're creating beautiful functional amenities by habitat creation, but it's also immersive ecological experiences. And regulating services, can go on. So we're just going to talk about how we get from this barren wasteland to the pristine Renosterveld. And this process was done by the rehabilitation strategy. So first you're going to use pesticides to get rid of all the alien invasive species. Then there was a burning to get rid of biomass, to make space for the native species to start taking over. And then soil amendments was, the soil was enhanced so that the indigenous species could have a good base to grow in. And there was a seeding process of about 2 years where different species were tested to see like which species would grow. And as soon as this was established, there was the succession period where succession species like trees and shrubs were implemented, and for maintenance purposes, as this is fynbos, it might need a second burn to establish it. And this process only takes about 8 years. So, and as for cultural services, I think a lesser known cultural service is ecological education. And I think Bottashalter is a great example of how you can provide very needed stewardship knowledge to the next generation of ecological stewards.
Right. Yeah, and I just wanted to say on that as well. So I've lost your video signal, Alice, but that's okay. Is that, as Alice said, the soil takes, or the vegetation takes about 8 years to get back to a somewhat stable state, and it's so much easier to actually just stay out of those areas. So as practitioners, we really need to encourage our clients to think very carefully about sprawling across land that has topsoil that's taken thousands of years to generate, and complex ecosystems that are really very rich and can't easily be restored. For example, just getting the seed for some of these species was really difficult. They have to be scarified, some of them have to be smoked, some of them have to go through acid baths, and so while we can do it and we can repair, we really should be thinking about how we can avoid and protect. The same thing with topsoil. The next time a client wants to scour topsoil so they can start building, if that is absolutely necessary, it's really important that you try and protect that. That stuff is gold, and it needs to be preserved in a certain way. So you need to get a good ecologist, even a good landscaper that knows how to stockpile that soil, so that all the microbes and the weed and the seed stock can be retained. So this is an old project of ours. It's probably more than 10 years old now, even more. It's Merriman Square down at the foreshore, and I think it's important to go back to it always for us, because it shows what can be done in such a limited amount of space. So this was a new building that was designed to connect two existing towers that were reclad in glass, and we were put forward by the city to come up with a scheme that took the plaza from this, which it was, I think, designed in the early 90s, and something quite of its time, and relating to the buildings as they were, into something else that was more contemporary. And so our client, Redefined Properties, was also putting their head office into that building over there. And we used the opportunity to harvest all the water that hits the roof and bring them down these shear wall columns into relaxation chambers and into these rain gardens at the base of the building. We also had this incredible urban canopy that was put forward by the urban designer that created this amazing north-facing room that is such a haven for urban wildlife, bird life, but also designed to attract people. So because it's on reclaimed land in a foreshore environment, we came up with this idea to reference that by creating a series of jetties and gangplanks, and also planted structures to bring down the scale of the building so people could sit all over the place. This is where Food Lovers Market is, so people can come and have their own lunch, or they can buy lunch. They can sit on the walls. We designed these lawns. Often students come and sit here and have their lunch. And we've got these breakout spaces next to the Herengracht where traders can put up their stands, and people can also have their lunch on that side and be part of that whole streetscape. This is how that system works. Water's captured onto the roof. What we can is put into tanks so we can use for irrigation. There's green walls that flank the central building so that these occupants can look out onto something green. The surplus water goes down those columns I showed you into those chambers. Because this has a massive parking basement as well, we have constant supply of groundwater that was pumped up into the system and then is filtered back down into these biobasins. I think what was remarkable about this project was that it was able to sustain itself during day zero, when Cape Town nearly ran out of water. I think this and Greenpoint Park, which I also had the privilege of working on, were some of the few places that we didn't have massive dieback of trees. And again, we think about how we use plants to enhance people's experience and just make places more enjoyable. And then jumping over to Australia, this is a project we're currently busy with. It's called M-Parks for a developer called Stockland, one of the biggest in Australia. And I'm told that this is this and the Atlassian Tower in the city centre are the last commercial buildings we'll see in at least 20 years, because people don't want to move into commercial anymore. So they've kind of swung this development as an innovation hub. They managed to land Johnson & Johnson as their anchor tenant, as their headquarters in Australia, and also a number of labs. We've got a medical clinic in this building and another medical tenant going into this building. So the architects are Danish. As you can probably tell, they look very Danish. Buildings are by 3XN, and Australian architect Crofi designed this building over here. It's also a massive, horrendous data center in the background. But we were brought in quite late on this project to peer review a design by others. Unfortunately, the planning of the site was done pretty badly. They planned a ring road that went around this building that divorced the buildings from their open space. So when we were brought in, we said we have to take it back and make it more about the park if we're ever going to attract people back into these kinds of work environments. So our concept was a workplace and a garden. And we managed to convince the developer to raise this building by 150 mils so that we could obliterate the curbs and stitch the buildings back across at grade into the park. Some of them have these balconies that look down onto the park, and then we paved these plaza spaces with cobbles so that they could be used for various events. And the few cars that we had to have, because this has an emergency department, we created this carport arbor where it's currently built and the creepers are getting in place at the moment. But again, we care a lot about context, and we're very fortunate in this project to be involved in with the First Nations Working Group, a group of Darug Aboriginal elders led by Auntie Jo Ray, who's a professor at Macquarie University, which is close to the site. And they've been really invaluable in helping us to understand context better. And so we've had a series of walks with them around the Lane Cove River. Our site sits just here next to one of the tributaries. And this river goes all the way down into the Sydney Harbour and past the Opera House and Harbour Bridge. But it's a very important and sacred place where the Aboriginal people perform various rites and obviously lived off the river as well. There's Auntie Jo and some of the Stockland team. And then we're brought in with the same team on another project, build to rent residential towers with an Australian-Japanese architect called Koichi Takada. So we were able to use both those learnings. And so we're still in the process of understanding the land and the significance, and trying to reveal some of those cultural practices and represent them in the site. But one of the main things that's come through is the people that lived in this area, the Wallumattagal people, and their totem is this snapper fish, or the wallumai. So we really, it was really important that we acknowledge the river. And so we've done that by referencing the river in a water system. So all the water, again, is captured on site. It comes through, is treated, and into this creek bed system that turns into a splash pad where workers can come and sit around the river. We've got water jets and misters, kids can play in it, but then it moves down into this creek system where it's purified, so that we make sure that we're not giving any kind of negative pollutants back to the water course. And then a lot of work going into understanding country and understanding the people that lived here before, and the significance of nature and the place of Wallamatta. So this is one of the mapping areas that shows the Wallumattagal country on the site. We've also worked through with the elders a number of significant species, and what's so great about how they engage with the land is it's so multisensory that their connection with seasons and natural processes is so rich. They're able to navigate the seasons by what flowers when, and that often is cues for when to go hunting for what, how to prepare food using different bush tucker, as they call it, species that we are bringing through into the park. This is the creek where we're filtering water, but also providing places for people to sit in nature. We've got a number of work pods where people can work outdoors with connected to Wi-Fi and electrical points, and we're bringing back a whole lot of tree species that are have been removed in this area over generations. The site is quite well integrated, has end of trip facilities, and they're really doing everything they can to try and bring people back to this place. So yeah, we're really very privileged to work on something like this and consider how people might use a park more actively, creating outdoor seating and dining spaces, outdoor gym areas, and places for people to gather and discuss the place, country, allowing places for First Nations people to be on site as well. And then dropping down in scale again, just to show how we think about context in very different ways. This is a project, a building by Ours Clear, Annemie van der Heever, for Malcolm Klook and Christian Dutoy. And if you don't know them, they are fashion designers and really cool guys that care deeply about living environments. And so our entry into this site was to acknowledge that this building had very Bauhaus vibes, but we didn't want to take it too literally. So we looked at the general era of modernism and looked for clues for how we could engage with the landscape. And Pete, our designer, submitted this image of Laszlo and the Holy Nagi, which really looks at the interplay between geometries and different spatial arrangements. And so we applied that to the landscape, as well as working with Malcolm and Christian to really elevate planting to create that incredible biophilic response for people where nature was just taking over. And so you can see it's really starting to get going now, and it's lovely. It's like, it would be great if it could just take over the whole building. But you can see how we work with architects and their design. A lot of the elements and geometries and spatial configurations we've tried to bring through and making sure that there are these connections between inside and outside. So you can see how the geometries of Maholi Nagi have been brought into the site. And it was quite clever because we were able to then create these little plunge pools, create little lawn spaces that didn't look too ridiculous, but fulfilled the function of a place for the dog to do his thing, and little hard surfaces and seating that operate as vents. Again, always thinking about how we design with multifunctionality, and thinking through how we can build planting onto buildings. And it's really important that we work closely with the architects and the engineers to be able to achieve planting of this kind of success. Over to you, Alice.
Yeah, and I just want to end off by saying that, it's very evident that as landscape architects, you have to consider all different scales at various sectors. So on the regional scale, the regenerative and ecological systems, down to the urban, where it's a lot about socioeconomic and cultural systems, and then all the way down to the residential, where we considered almost on a personal level, personal systems. And yes, thank you all so much for joining us.
Sorry,
Do you want to repeat?
No problem. So my question is relating to the development around working with the First Nations group in Australia. I was just curious, because I know like some projects, there has to be a lot of consideration when working with First Nations people. So I was just curious about like the hurdles that you faced or are currently perhaps still facing when sort of bearing in mind their wishes in the project as well.
I missed some. Let's relay that.
So his questions is, what are some of the hurdles we faced in working with First Nations people? You specifically as a company.
So I think Australia is has really embarking, especially through landscape architecture, on a journey with First Nations people. I think we're so very aligned in our ideals about caring for country, and I think as landscape architects, we care a lot about context. We're not trying to drive our own agenda, or we shouldn't be. And I think this project is quite an exemplar in that Stockland really cared to involve these people earlier on. I think it was a bit late in the project, so Auntie Jo Ray is really quite accomplished, and her first question when she got to site is that these buildings you're designing are sealed structures. There's no passive ventilation. They're dark. They're adding to urban heat island effect. And what are you doing with your stormwater? You're pushing polluted water back into Lane Cove River, where we've fished and lived for thousands of years. So I think that's the pressure that we really need to engage earlier on and throughout the whole project. So Stockland really took heed and upped their game. And so we've had very many consultations. And I think what's incredible is that the First Nations group of elders and knowledge holders have been so gracious in the way that they've understood how developers work, but they've also been really firm in pushing them to do better. I think one of the other things that is of interest is that ultimately people have been displaced from the land, and it's very hard for them to be brought back. You know, Sydney is very, very expensive, and it's hard for people to live on the land that they've held for generations.
Okay, thank you. There's another question.
Getting to this question, what are some of the beneficial things that you've learned that you wouldn't have got in your traditional education from working with the First Nations, and how has that added value to your best practice?
Okay, so the question is, what are some of the benefits that we learned? Sorry, maybe come up here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, my question was, what are some of the beneficial values and lessons that you've learned that you maybe didn't get in your traditional education from working with the First Nations, and how has that added value to your practice?
I think a lot of it is about taking time and stepping back, and committing to building the relationship. So one of the sayings is that the Darug people hold to is walking together in good spirit, and that takes time. And I think so often we're consumed with our own agendas for design, and we want to create these monuments to ourselves, but it's not really about that. It's in landscape architecture, we're trying to think about how we can do better by people and the environment. So we really have to slow down, listen, and I think be vulnerable in that process, and acknowledge that there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a richness that we can gain if we take the time. I'm a South African with some Australian ancestry, and who am I to work on this land? But I think if we just approach it with humility and curiosity and care for people, that's really, really important.
Other question? You want to come?
This is a question to both of you. I'm not sure if I'm talking loud enough. But
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite tree or plant? Maybe something that that's quite, I don't know, able to withstand a bunch of different temperatures and conditions, or just a favorite tree or plant in general?
Sure. I don't know, Alice. You go.
Did you get that?
Yeah.
Well, sure. I have a few. I think for me, a lot of the medicinal trees or medicinal plants in general is something that I hold dear to my heart. So think of the lavender tree, where I come from. They're quite abundant. So it's something I really enjoy, is if plants give other benefits other than just being there or being pretty. And I think the same would be for planting. If a plant has so much stories to it, and I think Mark did touch on it in his MPOC section of the presentation, where plants that have stories connected to them are so beautiful to me, as you can really create so much more meaning by using them within your landscapes. And there's this question of, should landscapes be something that's purely just there looking pretty, or should we challenge the norms to go out into a park and, why can't there be a culture of harvesting and allowing that? Sorry. And you, Mark?
It's like asking any designer or painter what their favorite color is. I suppose it's so context driven. At the moment, I'm really loving Carpobrotis, or Sirfe, it's called in the Cape. There are locally indigenous Carpobrotis here as well. They call it pig face. And it's really very cool for rehabilitating dunes, and we also use it on buildings, and it just does such a good job. It just hangs so far and so dense and can withstand wind and sun and everything. But I also secretly like South African plants that have been naturalized in Australia, after always having experienced Australian wattles and gum trees in South Africa. But on the indigenous side, I think I really enjoy some of the Cape fynbos, the Leucospermum, and on this side, very similar looking and interesting plants are the Grevilleas that are all flowering now. They're really striking. Although a British a celebrity gardener, I think his name was Monty Don, once said that the King Protea was the ugliest flower he'd ever seen, which I think is deeply offensive. And it's such a beautiful structural architectural plant. So yeah, those are some of my favorites.
Yeah, I think also just to add, it's a finicky tree, but it's not, it's still beautiful. It's the silver tree you find here on Table Mountain. It's just gorgeous. Yeah, that's a big consideration in the Cape, what plants are actually hardy enough to grow in soil which is not only clay-like and also sandy. So that's sometimes very challenging because, you know, there's not a lot of trees that actually withstand that conditions. But, you know, sandy luckily can find you quite a few. There's, yeah. Another question. Do you want to come closer?
Can I try shouting? I think I'm
Yeah.
loud enough. Sorry.
Yeah. Good voice.
First of all, thanks so much for the presentation. I think that a lot of us in this room are landscape architecture, either honors or master students. And I think it's super relevant to hear what you guys are talking about in terms of your projects and the kind of considerations that we should be taking forward as we kind of move to practice in the future. I was just wondering if there are any like trends you've noticed within landscape architecture in general that we should perhaps keep in mind as we go into the practice ourselves. Or if you have any, I don't know, other pieces of advice as we kind of step into the professional world.
Okay, so what trends in landscape architecture are there? And is there any pieces of advice that the students can take into as they're going into the practicing world?
Sure.
There.
I mean, do you have anything to say, Alice?
No, you're a bit frozen, but it's okay. You can speak. We hear you.
Okay. I think that we should avoid trends, and it's so important for us to just do the basics right, and that's why we're called Square One, because we take it back to basics. There's so many people fighting for attention and wanting to do things different. But what we're finding is that there's a real pushback towards some of those McHagian ideals of reading the landscape, really interrogating it, understanding what the landscape informants are. And that's really our role, is how do natural systems work on a site? How do water systems work? How do we protect them? And how do we keep development out of them? Because if we don't, as Alice showed, we're heading for disaster. And we've got enough disaster on our hands. And then also, how do you understand nature and craft it, design it in a way that brings out the wonderful qualities of it, that people really start to care about it. Yeah, Alice, how about you?
Yeah, so I actually this is something that the practice always emphasizes again and again and again. And I don't think it's necessarily a trend. I think it's rather how we should design, and it's considering systems, like what from a greater scale up into like the most intimate scale. How are you incorporating systems? How are you considering people and their rituals? So Yeah, and then at the end of the day, how do you make those systems something that means something rather than just functional? Because that's really how you're going to regulate the design at the end of the day and make something that has a durability aspect to it also.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like Borsius is quite a good example. We really thought hard about all the various systems, and I see Larissa's online as well. When she was working with us, she worked really hard to figure out how to combine certain species of trees in a way that they could actually survive on that complex site. And it's that kind of understanding and that rigor and knowing who to engage and how to get information, being resourceful, that enables us to create beautiful landscapes. And then that forms the basis for what we then work into and how people engage with it in various ways.
That's another question.
Time. I'm Mark Clinton here. Thanks very much for the presentation to you and your team. And well done. It's a very nice set of projects, and you guys have clearly worked really hard to land projects like this, but also execute them so well. So well done on that. My question is related to that. It seems like through the presentation you hint at what sounds like the necessity to convince people of greater opportunities than maybe what they were expecting you to do in the beginning, and to expand the vision and about the possibilities of landscape, and convince people, developers, clients, user groups, architects, the whole lot, that there's another way of thinking about something. So my question is just, what is your experience of doing that, and what can you share with us that seems to work?
Sure. Well, landscape architecture is just amazing. So through representation, through building arguments, through talking about principles, defending your work. If your work is built on principles, it's defensible. People often don't get it until the end, until it's built. We can see it with Merriman Square. The client didn't know what the heck we're doing. They would have liked to have just had a blank forecourt with a sculpture. In fact, that's what their original renders showed. Fortunately, the city of Cape Town pushed back on that. And we just drove the process all the way through. And once we delivered it, because their office is there, the head of Redefine would look down and see how successful it was, and he now attributes the success of the whole development, even though the landscape was only tiny from a budget point of view compared to the recladding of the building. He attributes their 90-something% occupancy rate up from 60-something% to the landscape, and he sits there and watches how people populate the space and how they gravitate to the planted areas. The same thing with M Park. The previous landscape architect was happy to just do landscape decorating and filling in around the buildings that were there. And when we were brought in, I think the project team knew that something was wrong, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong. And so when we came in and explained that it's really about creating this workplace in the garden, how do we make the place, the natural place, the most important thing, and everything else must support that. We can't design for roads and for buildings. We must design for place. I think that was really key. And the other thing, I know we're running out of time, but even at Borsius, even though the clients had these kind of connections to the land that he grew up on, he had somehow divorced himself, I think, from the significance of Renosterveld and the importance of it for all of our cultural heritage. And so by bringing that back in, even though they were like, well, this land isn't programmed, and then seeing how people love it and seeing how nature thrives and all those beautiful plants and birds and wildlife are coming back, that's what then starts to transform people's perceptions. And that's the skill that we have as designers, and that's what we need to use to show the world how to live better on this earth.
Cool. I think we're going to wrap up there, but thank you both, Alice and Mark, so much for presenting today, sharing your work with us, and everybody for attending. Thanks so much, and see you for the next School Talk.
Thank you.